and like young adult life, like outside of the military aspect and like the schooling aspect. So, I mean, what did you what did you like to do when you were a teenager when you were on the farm?
Um, Growing up on the farm, number one, we always had chores, and we had 4-H calves we had to take care of, and one of my jobs was to gather the eggs from the chicken house, and sometimes there'd be a hen sitting on the nest, and she'd peck at me, and I didn't like that. And sometimes you had to reach in under the hen to get the eggs. One of my jobs was to, number one, drive the team of horses when we were making hay, pulling the hay rope, which lifted the hay up into the barn. And soon we replaced the horses with a tractor. And that was still my job, to drive the tractor, to lift the hay up into the barn. My brother would usually stick the hay fork in. First it was loose hay, and then we went to baled hay. You still lifted it up with a big fork. And it went up to the top of the barn on a track and went inside, and then he pulled the rope and it tripped the fork and dropped either the loose hay or the bales inside the barn. There'd be someone inside the barn. Here stacked the bales. That was one of our summertime jobs. Seemed like we made lots of hay in the early days, because we used it to feed the dairy cows in the winter. And we made silage too. That's where you go into the field, you take the whole stalk of corn. In the early days, we cut the corn with a corn knife by hand and laid it in a bundle, and then they'd come along with a hay rack, pick up the bundles of corn and bring them into the silo where there'd be a ensilage cutter, and you feed the whole stalk of corn into the hopper, and it would take it into the cutter and chop it up real fine and blow it up into the upright silo. Later, as equipment advanced, there would be a field chopper that would would go down the row of corn and chop the corn, blow it into a wagon. Then you bring the wagon to the silo and dump it into a blower, which would blow it up into the silo. And even later, we would take the field chopped corn and put it on a surface silo, put it in the wagon and dump the wagon in a great big pile. On top of it was a cement slab on top of the ground. Called it a surface silo. We always made silage every year and baled lots of hay every year.
Was there anything when you were younger? It's like I've noticed that all the chores you've done, you start initially when you're younger. You start off doing the chores, and then as you got older, technology advances, and new equipment comes out for farming. Was that like dramatically different for you, or was it just way easier then?
Tremendous advancement. It was easier and quicker. You could get a lot more done in a day. It was the same way with harvesting corn. When I was young, it was all hand-picked. and we'd go out and shuck the corn off the stalk and throw it in a wagon. And you had a team of horses pulling the wagon, and you'd direct them by voice command, get up and whoa. And when you came to the end, you'd turn them around. And then we got a corn picker, and it went through the row of corn, one row at a time, and shuck the corn off the stalk, and then it would go through a series of rollers and take the husk off the ear of corn, and then it would go back to an elevator which delivered the corn into the wagon. It was the same wagon we used to throw the corn in by hand, and then we'd bring it into the crib at the farm, and then
Sorry to interrupt, but ordered too many donuts. And John and I can't eat them, so you two have to.
Oh, thank you.
What a piece there for you. And pretty soon we would get a 2-row mounted corn picker that mounted on the tractor, and you'd drive it through the field taking 2 rows at a time, and still it would husk the corn and deliver it into a wagon behind you until later they installed a sheller on the back of the picker. So we had a picker sheller, and it shelled the corn and delivered shelled corn into the wagon behind. And that was replaced by the combine, and the combine now does the work even today of harvesting the corn and husking it and shelling it and putting it in a bin, and then you dump it into a wagon or a truck and you bring it to the farm. We went from corn cribs, where the ears of corn were stored in cribs that let the air circulate through and keep the corn dry, to bins. When we put shelled corn, you put them in a steel bin, and then you have to dry the corn, because the corn usually comes in about 20% moisture, and you have to dry it down to 13% moisture with a great big blower dryer, heater dryer. And then you can store the corn indefinitely if it's 13% moisture or below. If it's above that, it's liable to spoil, to mold, and so forth. So even when your corn is stored, you have to monitor it to make sure that there isn't a wet spot and it's heating up and spoiling. You can't have a whole bin of corn go bad if you don't watch it. So that's what's done today, is combine the corn and they put it in a bin and they dry it and store it.
So when the technology was like, say like that corn picker, how old were you? Were you in your teenage years or when you were a little bit younger?
Well, we got our first 1-row corn picker, yes, when I was a teenager. I was a little kid when the men husked corn by hand. I was not old enough to be the man to go out and husk the corn, but I'd go with them and help as a little kid. And now when I was a teenager, we got the 1-row corn picker. But as soon as I came home from Iowa State to farm in 1947, we still had the 1-row corn picker. Of course, by that time I was 20 years old, 21, and but I got married in 49 and started farming for myself in 1950. And about the early 50s, I got the 2-row mounted corn picker and used that for a number of years, and then in the 60s I got the picker sheller and used that for several years, and then went to the combine in late 60s, I guess. The combine started out just hard. Well, of course, in the early days, for small grain like oats, we threshed. We'd go out in early July and they would have a binder come in and cut the oats and bind it into bundles with twine. And then by hand we'd go pick up the bundles and put them in shocks. They were about 10 bundles together, and they called them shocks. And then the oats would stand there for a couple weeks and dry. And then the big threshing machine would come. Sometimes it was pulled by a steam engine, but usually by the time I remember a steam engine coming once to our farm, but then it was with tractors. They'd bring the threshing machine, and that was always a chore. You had to go out and pitch this bundles onto a wagon, usually pulled by a team of horses, and bring the wagon load of bundles up to the threshing machine and throw the bundles into the threshing machine, which would separate the oats from the straw. And the straw would blow in a big pile, and the oats would go in a bin, and you'd haul them away on the wagon, usually a wagon. So the combine replaced all of that, those chores, all of those jobs of cutting, binding, shocking, and threshing. The combine was a combination of binder and thresher, and cut the oats and separated it from the straw, and put the oats in a bin, and then dumped them into a wagon. And then you came along later and baled the straw and used that for bedding. And that's essentially still done today. But there's not many oats raised. There's mostly soybeans. But the combine does the same thing for soybeans. It cuts them off and threshes them out and separates the hulls and spreads that out behind and puts the beans in a bin. And then you come with usually a truck nowadays, and you put the beans in a truck and you take them either to the farm to store in a bin, or else you take them to the terminal if you're selling them. And yesterday my son had beans down at Gringer's, and the elevator broke down at Gringer's. So he and his farmer neighbors were all standing around visiting while the repairs were made. That's what happens once in a while. But technology has greatly reduced the number of hours you have to spend doing everything. Planting, tilling, planting, harvesting, and it allows each individual farmer to farm many more acres than he could years ago. And that technology is continuing to advance. The one thing that's so startling is the technology in the breeding of plants. When I was young, when I first started farming, most farmers planted corn with a check wire. They'd plant